Jim Crow was the name of a racial caste system which consisted primarily in the South between 1877 and the mid-1960s. And if this is the type of content that you enjoy, you can find more content like this on MikeHistory.com. Also, if you want to support the channel, you can do so at my Patreon page or my Buy Me Coffee in the description below. Also, please give us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts and subscribe to the channel. But without further ado, let's get started.
New on Curiosity Stream. How do you connect a 16th century potato to limitless energy production? Could Napoleon's toothpick have a direct link to a machine that predicts the future? And how can a 1700s conch shell chart a course to humans connecting their brains to the internet? James Burke's visionary series Connections returns for a new generation. Experience all new Connections. With monthly, annual, and bundled plans, find the one that works for you at curiositystream.com.
The term Jim Crow derives from early 19th century minstrel shows. It was a popular form of entertainment which is the predecessor to vaudeville. The shows consisted of a primarily white song and dance performer crudely mimicking African Americans for the enjoyment of white audiences. One of the earliest and most famous was Thomas Daddy Rice, who devised a strutting, dancing character supposedly mimicking a prancing crow, and the character became known as Jim Crow. How the character named Jim Crow became a general term for America's racial segregation and discrimination is not known, but at some point during the 19th century, the term ceased to have anything to do with minstrel shows because their popularity had started to wane and instead signified the practice of disenfranchising, physically discriminating against African Americans. From the very beginning, Jim Crow was a way of life. Under Jim Crow, African Americans were relegated to the status of second-class citizens. Jim Crow was underpinned by the belief or the rationalization that whites were superior to blacks in intelligence, morality, and civilized behavior. Many Christian ministers taught whites that they were the chosen people and blacks were cursed to be servants. God supported racial segregation. Additionally, at almost every education level, they taught the belief that blacks were innately, intelligently, culturally inferior to whites. Pro-segregation politicians gave speeches about the dangers of integration and the mixing of races. Newspapers and magazines routinely referred to blacks as niggers and coons, and their articles reinforced anti-black stereotypes. Any activity that suggested social equality encouraged interracial unions, and interracial unions could produce a mixed race that would destroy America. Therefore, violence must be used to keep blacks in their place. In fact, during the 30s, when the Nazis had set out to disenfranchise and discriminate against their Jewish citizens, they closely studied the laws of Jim Crow in the United States. They admired the Jim Crow era laws and debated whether they should introduce a similar system of segregation in Germany. Additionally, when the idea of banning Jewish and Aryan marriages were presented to the Nazis, they once again looked to America to adopt an idea similar to the one-drop rule that stipulated that anyone with one drop of black ancestry was legally black and could not marry a white person. Jim Crow took place in 2 distinct forms: Jim Crow etiquette and Jim Crow laws, i.e. black codes. Jim Crow etiquette governed how African Americans should behave in white society, and sometimes the etiquette would vary from person to person. For instance, black males could not offer their hand to shake to a white male or any other part of their body to a white female. Black males couldn't even light the cigarette of a white female. Blacks and whites were not supposed to eat together, but if they did eat together, whites would be served first. A black couple was not allowed to show affection towards one another in public. Whites did not use courtesy titles of respect when referring to African Americans, like Mr. or Mrs. or Ma'am. Instead, blacks were referred to by their first name. But blacks absolutely had to use courtesy titles when referring to whites and could not use their first name. This informality of whites using the first names instead of courtesy titles caused many African Americans to start using initials for their first name. Jim Crow etiquette operated in conjunction with Jim Crow laws, i.e. Black codes. Black codes excluded blacks from things like public transportation and facilities, juries, jobs, neighborhoods. The passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment to the Constitution granted blacks some of the same legal protections as whites. However, after the Compromise of 1877, the South and border states began restricting the liberties of African Americans once again. Over the next few years, segregation and disenfranchisement picked up pace in the South, and it was more or less tolerated in the North. In 1890, Louisiana passed the separate car law. This Louisiana law made it illegal for blacks to sit in coach seats reserved for whites, and whites couldn't sit in coach seats reserved for blacks. The idea was to aid passenger comfort by creating equal but separate facilities for blacks and whites. But this was a joke. Almost no public accommodations, including railway travel, provided blacks with equal facilities. So, in 1891, a group of blacks decided to test the Jim Crow law. They had a man by the name of Homer Plessy, who was 1/8 black, sit in the white-only coach section, and he was, of course, promptly arrested. Plessy's lawyers argued that Louisiana did not have the right to label one citizen as black and another as white for the purpose of restricting their rights and privileges. On May 18, 1896, the Supreme Court delivered its verdict, and by a 7-2 vote declared the separate but equal facilities constitutional on interstate railroads. The court ruled that the protections of the 14th Amendment applied only to political and civil rights and not social rights. Judge Henry Brown wrote, to consist in the assumption that the enforced separation of two cards stamps the colored race with a badge of inferiority, if this be so, it is not by any reason found in the act, but solely because the colored race chooses to construct upon it. The Plessy versus Ferguson verdict legitimized two different societies, one white and superior, and the other black and disenfranchised. For blacks, the Supreme Court further underpinned the constitutional protections of blacks and made Jim Crow laws a way of life. The Plessy versus Ferguson verdict sent the message that discrimination against blacks was acceptable, so other laws followed, like grandfather clauses, as well as poll taxes, white-only primaries, and literacy tests. Other states passed statutes severely regulating social interactions between the races. Jim Crow signs were placed on water fountains, door entrances, and exits in front of public facilities. There were separate hospitals for whites and blacks, separate prisons, separate public and private schools, and separate restrooms. And of course, in most instances, black facilities were grossly inferior, and in other cases, there were no black facilities at all. The Plessy versus Ferguson verdict gave Jim Crow states a legal way to ignore their obligations to African Americans as citizens of this country. Jim Crow laws and the system of etiquette was backed by the threat of violence. African Americans who violated those social norms by drinking at a white water fountain or trying to vote risked everything from their homes to their jobs to their very lives. Whites could physically beat blacks with complete immunity, and blacks had little legal recourse against these assaults because the criminal justice system was a part of the Jim Crow system. Matter of fact, violence was instrumental in Jim Crow because it was used as a method of social control to enforce the racial hierarchy. The most extreme form of this violence was lynching. The legal definition of lynching is with 3 or more persons put someone to death without legal sanction. Jim Crow lynchings were public, often sadistic murders carried out by mobs, and from 1882 to 1968, there were almost 4,730 known lynchings, and 3,440 of them were made up of black men and women. Black lynchings accounted for 72% of the total lynchings that we know of. Well, most victims were hung or shot, but they could be burned at the stake, castrated, beaten with clubs, or dismembered. During the mid-1880s, whites constituted majority of the lynching victims. However, after Reconstruction, blacks more frequently became victims of lynching. During the lynching era, white lives were held at a higher value, while the lives of African Americans held little to no value. Law-abiding African Americans lived with a daily risk of arbitrary and possibly deadly violence. One of the first major challenges to Jim Crow since Plessy versus Ferguson was Brown versus the Board of Education. In the decision that was issued on May 17, 1954, the court concluded in its opinion by declaring segregated public school education inherently unequal in a 9-0 decision. They stated that this violated the Equal Protection Clause. The Equal Protection Clause is the part of the first section of the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution, and the clause provides that nor shall a state deny any person within its jurisdiction equal protection under the law. This decision declared that segregated public schools were unconstitutional, and that decision had far-reaching social ramifications. During the early 60s, after numerous civil rights demonstrations and protests were held, particularly in the South, the civil rights movement pushed the Kennedy administration to give their full-fledged support to a civil rights bill. President Kennedy sent the civil rights bill to Congress, but legislation was blocked. After Kennedy's assassination, President Lyndon B. Johnson called for the immediate passage of Kennedy's civil rights legislation as a memorial to the deceased president. Johnson formed a coalition that led to the passage of the bill in early 1964. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 guaranteed public accommodations at restaurants and authorized the Justice Department to bring suits to force desegregation of facilities in schools, also gave new powers to a Civil Rights Commission, and allowed federal funds to be cut off in cases of discrimination. By 1965, Lyndon B. Johnson also called for stronger voting rights laws and began working on what became the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 ended any legal barriers to voting at all federal and state and local elections. It provided federal oversight and monitoring to counties with historically low minority voter turnout. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 made Jim Crow laws technically illegal. Many African Americans paid for Jim Crow with their lives, and the impact of the long history of Jim Crow continues to be felt in the United States today. Thank you. This has been One Mic. I'm your host, Country Boy. If you like more content like this, you can find more content like this at OneMicHistory.com. Also, if you want to support the channel, you can do so at my Buy Me Coffee or my Patreon in the description below. And please subscribe to the channel and give us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts. Peace.